So welcome. I think we should start. We had some technical glitches as usual. Welcome everyone. Welcome our special guests. Welcome everyone online. If there is any, I cannot see if there is any. And welcome Hassan and Adam, who I will introduce in a second. We are here to celebrate the launch of this book, After Border Externalization, Migration, Race and Labor in Mauritania. And the event is organized by the CMDS, the Center for Migration Diaspora Studies, which Oslem, Zinner, Biner, and I chair. And it is part of the SOAS Global Development Seminar Series. And in fact, we're particularly happy to bring together these two souls, to have two speakers, a speaker and a discussant, who have had in the past or are currently, kind of sitting across both development studies and anthropology and the Center for Migration and Development Studies and diaspora studies. We keep doing this. So look, if you haven't done so already, you must go to the Bloomsbury Publishers webpage, fork out £80 and buy it. Okay? Or you can download it for free in the same web page in case, I don't know, for whatever reason you don't want to spend those funds. The book is online, it's available online to read for free, and it is, I think, a must read. I don't want to anticipate much of the book, but the way I see it, it's a really beautiful ethnography of the ways in which the EU border or borders in general kind of get into places, ingrain themselves, are modified, deflected by a variety of forces, agents, people's lives. And you read this book and you find suddenly yourself amidst, some congregation of workers in some dusty squares in Nouakchott, and you do. I mean, the ethnography is really beautiful in some offices of the Guardia Civil, which he doesn't say so, but I always imagine pot-bellied and with mustache. Yeah, pretty much. In Nouadhibou, or indeed, cat and mouse game between border guards and migrants across the Senegal River. And more, it's a vivid ethnography, but it's a vivid ethnography that is put, at the service of a very, I would say, innovative theorization, one that really seeks to go deeper into our understanding of the EU border, and that, in fact, anticipates a lot of the debates which are, the border externalization scholars are grappling with today. I mean, a lot of in fact, most of the debates that I've been peer reviewing and indeed publishing myself very recently are somehow catching up with what is contained in this book. So as I said, it's a must read. I will stop here. I will formally introduce our speakers, our speaker and our discussant, and I will let them steal the show. So Dr. Hassan Ould Moctar is a lecturer in the anthropology of migration at SOAS, and his research and the research that emerges in this book and from this book kind of bridges the fields of anthropology and development studies by studying processes such as processes of illegalization and the way in which they interact with racial and territorial legacies of colonialism, with uneven development processes, with conflict and displacement. Beyond this book, he has published in Environment and Planning, Society and Space, in Geoforum, in Anthropologie et Développement in French. There you go. So thanks, Hassan, and many thanks to Professor Adam Haniyeh for generously acting as a discussant. Adam is a professor in the political economy and global development at the University of Exeter and joint chair in Middle East Studies at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He's also the director of MERIP and in a research fellow at the Transnational Institute. He's the author of numerous books. I'll mention the multiply awarded Money Markets and monarchies, maybe not in that order, but almost in that order. And for sure, his latest book, which is published by Verso, which was recently launched at SOAS, Crude Capitalism, Oil, Corporate Power, and the Making of the World Market. So it's going to be a fairly standard setup. Hassan will talk about his book. Adam will raise a few questions, and then, hopefully there will be a good discussion afterwards. So welcome, come join us.
Thank you so much, Paolo, for the excessively generous introduction, but I think also just for the incredible supervision over the course of the PhD project. I really couldn't have asked for a better supervisor. It made the entire experience a pleasure, and it's just so rare, I think, for people to be able to get to say that. So I wanted to just take the opportunity to thank you, Paolo, for all of the, at times, anxiety and existential dread-inducing comments, but ones that were ultimately extremely productive of what came out of the process. And thanks, Adam, also for the inspirational conversations over the years. To just maybe contextualize where this book is coming from, it, I guess, most formally emerges from a PhD project that I started here in SOAS in 2016. But that itself was a continuation of a master's project that I did at the University of Amsterdam in 2014-15 with some kind of preliminary field work, much on the same topic. And that itself was an amalgamation of a undergraduate degree in Maynooth University in Ireland in 2012, a politics degree and a dissertation on the effects of EU migration policies in North Africa, and a French undergraduate dissertation on the colonization of Mauritania, which itself, I think, was preceded by a year in Mauritania in 2010, during which I did some very kind of rudimentary archival research. So this is just to say that everything that's here has been something that I've been thinking about and working on for the best part of 15 years now, and it's just a relief to finally get it behind me and out into the world. And the fact that it has been moved upon for 15 years, in one sense, I think has the benefit of being had a lot of thought and reflection going into it, but it also means that the book is kind of burdened by all the other things that I've been thinking about and the interest that I've acquired over that time. So there might be a sense in which it's kind of pulling in different directions at the same time. I thought I would just very, very quickly just try and tell the story the book tells, and then have an open-ended conversation about it. I thought before doing that, we could just bring it up to speed with things that have been happening on the Atlantic route to the Canary Islands and in Mauritania in particular since the time that the final draft was submitted, because things have very much, I guess, accelerated in the interim. The NGO Comandando Fronteras put out its Right to Life monitoring report this year, observing that the Atlantic route to the Canary Islands has seen upwards of 10,000 deaths this year. They say this is an average of 31 deaths per day, meaning that the, I guess, dubious status of world's most deadliest border zone has shifted from the central Mediterranean to the west Mediterranean and the Atlantic over the past year. And they also observed that Mauritania, which is a real departure from the things that I'll be talking about in the research, the situation at the time of the research that I'll be presenting was conducted. Mauritania is now the primary departure point for these arrivals and these deaths. 2023 was itself unprecedented in both terms of deaths at sea and arrivals on the Canary Islands. Context, that was 57,000 arrivals according to the UNHCR at the end of 2023. This is unprecedented in its numerical scope, but the figures here of deaths aren't mentioned, which I think are worthy of further consideration in the number of arrivals. So with a view to preventing these arrivals, the European Commission signs a migration partnership deal with the Mauritanian state around this time last year in March of 2024 that promises things like support to the Mauritanian border security forces for things like bolstering border management and surveillance capacities, cracking down on police smuggling networks, and kind of less militarized and quote unquote softer measures like strengthening the asylum system in the country and promising jobs at origin and circular migration schemes. So, in a word, all of these measures, both the hard militarized ones and the softer development ones, are oriented around the aim of preventing unwanted migration to the Canary Islands, in this case, at its perceived point of origin. And it's this kind of plethora of measures, in broad terms, that is what we mean when we talk about border externalization. Such externalization deals are not confined to Mauritania. Similar such deals have been signed with Egypt, Tunisia, and Lebanon over the course of 2023, building upon an infamous deal that was signed with Turkey in 2016. And nor are these externalization deals new in this particular context. The press release from the European Commission here on the right dates to 2006 and announces a similar suite of measures aimed at preventing so-called irregular arrivals on the Canary Islands. So we're now nearly, 20 years into a strategy of preventing unwanted migration to the Canary Islands that has manifestly failed on its own terms, both in terms of the number of deaths at sea and the volume of arrivals on the Canary Islands. To, scholars of migration and border policy, this apparent failure wouldn't be that much of a surprise. Many have pointed out, Ruben Anderson, I think most prominently in the context of West Africa, that policies aimed at preventing irregular migration to the Canary Islands or to Europe in general end up producing more of what they claim to prevent. They end up producing more irregular migration, more experiences of illegality, and in doing so can justify their own existence, because if you create a problem and you present the solution to the problem, you can justify the continuation of that solution. And this draws on a much wider range of literature, anthropologists, legal scholars, who've highlighted in various ways how migration policies in general and restrictive migration policies in particular which are formally aimed at preventing unwanted movement, end up producing more of that movement. So if this is the case, that EU migration policies and migration and border regimes in general produce more illegality, more experiences of what Nicholas de Geneva will call migrant deportability, the empirical components of this book, pose the question of who is likely to be illegalized and why. So Mauritania and the sites beyond the EU border in general are not a blank slate. There are pre-existing social conditions and relations and histories that mean that particular swathes of people will likely to be subject to experiences of illegalization, while other groups of people won't fall under the spotlight of illegality. So answering this question, the empirical contents of the book foreground the social relations in which border externalization policies manifest, both the history of European intervention in the region and in Mauritania in particular, and the social relations that have emerged from that history, and in doing so try to, challenge the Eurocentric basis of these policies, which generally reduce regions beyond the external border to this blank slate that are potential source points of irregular migration. The jargon that's often used is potential candidates for irregular migration. So people who have no intention of migrating to Europe, often EU bordering logics and policies tend to illegalize them, irrespective of their actual itineraries or intentions as regards to migration. So to do this, the book draws from a wide range of scholarship that has emerged from around 2016, the same time that I started the PhD, that in different ways tries to challenge the Eurocentrism of migration policies, but also certain strands of migration and border studies literature. Some do this by highlighting the colonial context and precedents of the bureaucratic regulation of mobility. Others highlight the agency that non-EU state actors in contexts like Mauritania, Spain, Turkey, the agency that they have in the implementation of externalization. And the book draws from each of these different perspectives and methods of challenging Eurocentrism and the study of externalization to answer this question of who is likely to be illegalized, where does the, I guess, for want of a better term, raw material that the EU border regime draws upon in its production of illegality, where does that material come from? What is the underlying social condition that produces and provides the material for border policies to illegalize? So it draws attention to certain, I think the book itself pays a lot of attention to pre-colonial history and dynamics, and traces three aspects of territorial organization throughout these periods of Mauritanian history: the pre-colonial period, the colonial period, and the post-colonial period. For reasons of, I guess, brevity, I'll just draw attention to the colonial period and a shift in territorial organization that happens at this moment in time, which the book suggests have a strong bearing upon how externalization unfolds in the present. The first of these is that what were open frontier zones become transformed into linear borders. This is true in the Sahara and the vast frontier zones that separated different emirates in the Sahara, but it's especially important in the on the Senegal River Valley due to the fact that the pre-colonial kingdoms in the 19th century and before that were I guess contiguous zones of circulation and governance that linked the north banks of the Senegal River and the south banks of the Senegal River. With the colonial shift in territorial organization, the river becomes a line separating what is now the colonial territory of Mauritania from the Senegalese territory, or the French territory of colonial Senegal. And this transformation immediately, as a result, transforms human mobility into migration, which is subject to bureaucratic regulation and governance. This is the case in what is now the internal administrative zones of the colonial territory of Mauritania, but it's especially pertinent as regards mobility across the banks of the Senegal River, which are now migrations from the colonial territory of Senegal into the colonial territory of Mauritania. And lastly, and I guess relatedly, territorial belonging becomes racialized. So a colonial imaginary of how group belonging works in the region, and in particular the idea that Arab Moors belong north of the Senegal River and Black Africans belong south of the Senegal River. This colonial imaginary is endowed with material form and consequences, and there are details about the taxation regime that are put in place that give form to this colonial imaginary. And it has particular consequences for Fulani populations living north of the Senegal River, who are within this colonial imaginary and the policies that are implemented on its basis, now deemed to belong in Senegal, despite their physical residence on the colonial territory of Mauritania. There's a lot of ways in which this racialization of territorial belonging that occurs at this moment in time, and the kind of proto-exclusion of Afro-Mauritanians from the territory of Mauritania, a lot of ways in which these come to structure post-colonial politics and contestation in particular that I'm going to skirt over, but we would draw attention to one incident that kind of sees them come to a head in 1989 to 1991. Now, there are other things happening at this moment in time that also determine the what are now remembered as the events of 1989 to 1991. A liberalizing land reform, for example, in 1983, which transforms a system of customary collective land tenure into one of private ownership. This effectively, in the words of the OECD, legalized expropriations of Afro-Mauritanian communities living in the region. A period of droughts and ecological crisis in the Sahara, much of the Sahel at this time, creates pressures, migratory pressures on the Senegal River that accelerates these expropriations. And this is, I guess, the backdrop to a what otherwise would have been a quite innocuous micro-level grazing dispute between herders and farmers in 1989, which escalates into a mass expulsion of Afro-Mauritanians, in addition to about 100,000 Senegalese nationals from Mauritania in 1989 to 1991. So about 60,000 people are expelled. This is, I guess, a confluence of the three dimensions of territorial organization that I mentioned a moment ago. The Senegal River is viewed as this cliff edge beyond which those deemed not to belong are to be pushed. Not just migration and the bureaucratic regulation of migration, but the forced movement that is involved in the expulsion and deportation of people deemed not to belong is carried out both by vigilante forces and state forces. And lastly, the racialization of territorial belonging means that people who would otherwise be considered nationals of the territory are deemed not to belong and are deported in very large numbers to Senegal. So what all of this has to do with externalization, well, the year 2006, which I mentioned a moment ago, launched the era of externalization in Mauritania, was also the year of the highest number of expulsions from Mauritanian state territory since the events of 1989. So this increase in arrivals in the Canary Islands in end of 2005, 2006 results in a slew of measures aimed at preventing these arrivals, the deployment of maritime and aerial assets by Spain and Frontex, the construction of a detention center in the northern city of Nouadhibou, so that people who are intercepted off the coasts can be processed and deported, and a deployment of Spanish Guardia Civil and police also to Nouadhibou to both police migrants in the city and to capacity build and train their Mauritanian counterparts. So as these arrivals begin to diminish, I guess what's viewed as an opportunity on the part of the Mauritanian government and their Spanish counterparts to modernize migration management in the country is seized. And the form that this takes, the book kind of details how the shift in territorial organization mentioned in the previous slides, how this becomes reinvigorated as a result of this drive to modernize migration management. So if we go back to the three aspects of territorial organization: borders, human mobility, and belonging. The borders that are drawn during the colonial era, they become subject to a modernization drive, both in the construction of new entry points. I think there were only about less than 20 before 2010. This gets increased to 47, and in the modernization of existing entry points, installing separate buildings to ensure that entry and exit are kept separate, equipping border posts with biometric card readers and visa issuance technologies. At the same time, there's a biometric residence permit that is introduced in 2012, which, if the production of migrant illegality in 2006 as a result of these temporary externalization measures was something of an emergency measure that was introduced at the behest of Spain and the European Union, the introduction of the biometric residence permit cements this within the institutional structures of the Mauritanian state and of the police in particular. And numerous people that I spoke to would detail the raids and deportation operations that are carried out under the guise of preventing migration, irregular migration, and of managing migration in line with the aims of the national migration strategy. And it results in, as I said, the renewal of the experience of being liable to be deported from the Mauritanian state territory, which resonates with the experience of being deported in the 1980s for somewhat kind of distinct reasons. And those distinct reasons, those also manifest in the last dimension of territorial organization, so the racialization of territorial belonging, mentioned a moment ago in the context of expulsions from the Senegal River Valley. This becomes renewed as well, because the biometric overhaul of the civil registry that formed part of the introduction of this residence permit also is part of a broader overhaul of the civil registry that gives rise to sentiments within Afro-Mauritanian communities of being excluded again from the Mauritanian state, and of being once again terms like biometric genocide and administrative deportation start doing the rounds on parts of communities, Fulani and Afro-Mauritanian communities. So this begins to show what is detailed in more ethnographic terms in a moment, that the line between nominally deportable non-nationals and non-deportable citizens that structures ideas of citizenship and national belonging. This is infused with race, and that racialization means that people who are nominally within the boundaries of inclusion in the Mauritanian state end up sometimes deported, but at least issued with threats of deportation on quite a regular basis. So this is just a very broad cursory overview of how the history of colonialism and the afterlives that emerge from the colonial encounter, they shape the form that externalization takes as it's implemented and shifts to this more, I guess, non-emergency modernization of migration management form. But it doesn't do much at this point to highlight the social relations in which the condition of migrant illegality and deportability manifest. And at this register, it's still pretty, I guess, Eurocentric, to the extent that if Mira Sabaratnam's discussions of Eurocentrism are anything to go by, and I draw quite centrally from them in the book, the tendency within scholarship to exclude the targets of intervention in the analysis of external intervention is itself a Eurocentric and in some fashions colonial exclusion. So for this reason, the rest of the book and the ethnographic chapters that I'll quickly skirt through move to looking at the experiences of targets of this form of external intervention, namely externalization. So the first ethnographic chapter goes to the city of Nouadhibou, which is the primary departure point for people trying to get to the Canary Islands. So as I mentioned a moment ago, a primary site, the policing of so-called irregular migration in the city. And the book looks a little bit at the subjective experiences and aspirations of migrants that I met in the city on the one hand, and how they relate to this vast apparatus of migration control that is aimed at preventing them from leaving, which of course includes police officers, national police, Guardia Civil, but also includes humanitarian agencies and actors. And it looks a bit at how that interplay between European movement and the policies and structures that try to keep people where they are, how that relates to the broader political economy and development trajectory of the city. I'll discuss that with reference to the experience of one migrant worker that I met, a young Mauritanian by the pseudonym of Ba, who told me about trying to get to the Canary Islands in 2014, arriving by pirogue, which is the French word for these fishing canoes that are artisanal fishing canoes, but which have also become primary means of making the Atlantic route, making the Atlantic journey. He arrives, spends 2 months in a Red Cross run detention center, and then finds himself back in Mauritania. And despite this, is determined, in his words, to make it again. He's going to go at all costs. So this, I guess, speaks to the power of agency and what some scholars would call autonomy of migration. And this chapter thinks a little bit about that determination and this subjectivity in those terms, but also looks at what his life history might tell us about the broader economic development trajectory of the Mauritanian state, and as a result, shows a little bit of what the form contemporary capitalism takes, how that relates to the social relations in which migrant illegality is produced. So his father was a migrant worker that worked in a mine in the northern town of SOAS, which itself is somewhat significant for a couple of reasons. It shows the structural reliance of the Mauritanian state in the early decades of independence upon migrant labor, for reasons of the livelihood activities of the majority of the national workforce at that time. There was a need within a number of sectors, in particular the nascent mining industry, for external labor, primarily from Senegal, from Mali. It also shows the, I guess, limitations and contradictions of formal political independence, given that this mining company was just at the eve of formal decolonization, owned by a conglomeration of Mauritanian, or European rather, steel interests. And this is a kind of a clear-cut case of what scholars at the time called dependency theory. Samir Amin included this mining operation within one of his case studies on neocolonialism in West Africa. Now, by the time Ba, the son of this Senegalese migrant worker, makes his journey to the Canary Islands, things have changed quite a bit through a combination of the effects of structural adjustment programs, rural-urban migrations, and the consequent expanding informal economy. He and many others I spoke to would say that their work opportunities revolved around mobile phone repairs, working on the fish meal and fish oil factories that have cropped up around the city, or on the trawlers, all without any formal contract, and this structural prevalence of the informal economy and what Tanya Murray-Lee calls the global surplus population is a key aspect of how the production of migrant illegality relates to the underlying social relations of contexts such as Mauritania. But the exclusive focus in this particular context on Europe-bound trajectories and Europe-bound movement, that itself replicates some of the Eurocentric assumptions that the book tries to overcome. So for that reason, the next chapter moves to the southern border town of Rosso, which straddles the Senegal River. One half of the town is situated in Mauritania, the other half of the town is situated in Rosso. This division is itself a product of the colonial era, the rendering of the Senegal River a territorial border between Mauritania and Senegal, but it's also sustained by the infrastructure of externalization in the present. So the border infrastructure project that I mentioned a while ago, one of the border posts that was targeted for revamping is this border post. And through drawing on much of the literature on borders, not least Paolo's discussion of the productivity of border regimes, the chapter also looks at how that infrastructure of externalization is kind of rendered incomplete and has to compromise with certain social realities on the ground, so to speak, like the fact that the majority of crossings are by people who live in one side of Rosso and work on the other. So this, I guess, shows how externalization, as it's being implemented, isn't this smooth transfer from the quote-unquote outside or inside to the outside, but ends up being reshaped by the dynamics on the outside. Chapter also, I'll go through this quite quickly, but looks at experiences of people who weren't on the move to Europe when I met them, but whose experiences of border violence and legalization in many other contexts are very much reminiscent of what the literature calls the production of migrant illegality. But these two individuals were quite content from the conversations, and we had many conversations outside this vegetable stall. They're quite content to leave Europe behind as a ambition and to work in the rice industry. One of them worked in a rice processing factory and another in on the rice fields. And looking at this decision to leave Europe in the past and to focus on the conditions of the rice industry and the possibility to sustain oneself there, opens a window into how externalization and EU migration policies intervene and relate to the history of dispossession and expulsion that I mentioned a moment ago. Because there is a history of violence underpinning that rice industry that this chapter delves into in a bit of kind of ethnographic detail. So if you recall that I mentioned there were mass expulsions in the 1980s, 60,000 or so Afro-Mauritanians who were deported from the state. Some of those who were deported returned in 1989, but crucially don't return to the lands that they were deported from, but to purpose-built accommodation centres that were located on the outskirts of Rosso. One photo which you can see here. And for these reasons, the returnee community that I interviewed viewed the issue of land restitution to be completely central to a complete return to their homeland, but this issue seemed pretty difficult to resolve at the time that I had been that I did my fieldwork there, which is in 2018, for the simple reason that, in the words of one human rights activist I was speaking to, there are now, as a result of this process of expropriations and expulsions, certain agribusinessmen who hold 3 or 4 or 500 hectares and don't do anything to develop them, and then there are these collectives such as the returnees who have used to have land and now have returned to nothing. So this is all just to say that while people who were deported and then returned are somewhat discarded on the outskirts of Russell, migrants who are elsewhere illegalized by the EU border regime are also wrapped up in this regional history of expulsions and accumulation by dispossession. And this ties together what, from a strict, I guess, focus on migration and border policies in isolation might miss, which is what Sandra Mazzato would call a diverse set of subjective experiences within the composition of contemporary living labour. So people who have tried to get to Europe and have failed and are now working in the rice industry and find this relatively a relative benefit. And this rice industry emerges from an experience of expropriation and dispossession. So this history of the effects of the racialization of territorial belonging and how the externalization process intervenes within it is another ingredient of answering this question of how or who is likely to be legalized and why. And the final chapter of the book kind of brings those 2 previous ethnographic concerns together, the focus on the history of capitalist development in Nouadhibou and the history of racialization and its effects in the present in Russell, and examines how the experience of illegalization is shaped by each of these 2 different processes. So this is one labor pickup point that I spent quite a bit of time hanging out in the city centre. It was kind of a go-to point for people who had just arrived and also for people who were saving up money to either make the journey onward or to stay where they are. And this was a site of intense policing by the municipality and the National Guard and gendarmerie as I was at the time that I was there. But the more time that I spent there, the more that it seemed that there was a kind of a distinct logic at play in these policing operations, aside from migration management strictly defined. So for one thing, the policing operations often seem to target people who were Mauritanian nationals, Afro-Mauritanians, for the reasons of the racialization of territorial belonging that I mentioned a moment ago. For example, the words of some people I interviewed, community representatives, police would be kind of not very discerning when it came to conducting the migration raids that were incentivized by Spain and the EU, would just round everybody up and ask questions later. As one journalist suggested, it was primarily Black Africans who were targets of these raids, certainly not Europeans, but not Moroccans or North Africans either. So this shows how racial discrimination and Afro-Mauritanian identity ends up falling within the scope of deportability in the context of migration policing. But another reason that there was something else at play than just migration policing was that it wasn't in people's capacity as migrants per se that they were targeted for deportation or detention, but it was also in the capacity of workers in the informal economy on a pretty regular basis, in particular in the run-up to a African Union Summit that took place in Nouakchott in July 2018. Sites like this would be the site of raids by police, by municipality and other officials, threatening people with confiscation of their informal workers' materials, in this case, car washing materials. And sometimes this would overlap with the way that migration policing happens. So people would be issued with threats of deportation, for example. But it seemed that it was primarily as in people's capacity as informal workers rather than illegalized or so-called irregular migrants that these operations were being conducted. And most crucially, people would often interpret their experience of urban clear-out operations and migration policing in quite similar terms. So people wouldn't really distinguish between being harassed and threatened with deportation for reasons of lacking a residence permit and for reasons of being in a part of the city that they were not supposed to. From their point of view, it was very much, sometimes we're targeted because we're informal workers, sometimes it's because we're migrants, but it's all different parts of the same attitude that the state has towards us. So this got me thinking in more general terms just about the role of the informal economy in Mauritania, but in many parts of the global south, most directly with reference to the work of Kayan Sanyal, but also Tanya Murali, Gargi Bhattacharya, Ali Matsatri in this department. And from this perspective, the presence of a vast urban informal economy, I think it was something like 91% of non-agricultural private sector activity is informal in Mauritania in 2017. This is not an outlier or a kind of aberration to formal wage labor relations, but it is in itself constitutive of what capitalism is in many parts of the global south. Sanyal puts it as those who have been, it's the condition of those who've been expelled from the agricultural sector and at the same time excluded and segregated from the glittering modern urban economy. So processes of dispossession, such as those that we saw in the case of the Senegal River Valley, don't result in people entering wage labor. They often end up in people consigned to what Mike Davis calls the planet of slums, and a small proportion of that population end up trying to get to Europe. And it must be stressed, it's a very tiny proportion. So this, I guess, is the underlying condition that I felt was providing the material for border regimes and the externalization process in particular to draw from in the legalization of migration and in the production of what Ruben Anderson, Nicholas de Geneva, and many others call migrant illegality. So to just quickly address this question of who is likely to be illegalized and why, it's in very short terms, the coalescence or the overlap between a racialization of territorial belonging that ensued in the colonial era and the dynamics of capitalist development, the presence that produce a vast surplus population that provides border regimes with the means of justifying their own existence. This is where and why some people are likely to be illegalized rather than others. Doing so is kind of foreground of the social and historical context in which externalization policies intervene, and this does avoid the Eurocentrism of the externalization process, but also I hope is part of a broader collective scholarly and, more importantly, activist discussion about tackling these policies and overcoming the Eurocentrism of even those of us who are trying to act and work in solidarity with people affected by them. There's a lot more on the theoretical side that I won't go into. This is just a short little description of the empirics. Thanks for the attention and participation, and looking forward to conversation and comments.
Thank you, Hassan. Adam, you can kindly illuminate and discuss and open up this discussion for us. It's appreciated.
I want to begin by thanking Hassan for writing this book. I'm assuming not many of you in the room have had a chance to look at it and look at the. It's good to hear. Actually, it's downloadable for free. I have my £80 copy. Book reader. I really want to. You got a sense, I'm sure, from the discussion today, how rich Hassan's work is. It's really, I think, a remarkable piece of work in the sense that it says a lot theoretically, and I want to talk about some of this stuff today, and you got a sense, I'm sure, from Hassan's introductory remarks there. It's really rich theoretically. It speaks to so many different debates around borders, about race, around migration, obviously. At the same time, it's grounded in this kind of really deep understanding of the colonial history of not just Mauritania, but also the wider West African region. And then finally, it's the ethnographic work is really extraordinary. It's so rare to read a work that is grounded in all of these spaces and really is done in a very readable way. So I would highly recommend this. I'm certain it's going to become a book that will be a reference point around these debates around borders, but also I think a really good teaching resource in SOAS and elsewhere, because it's very readable, and I also really appreciated the footnotes. Actually, there's so much hidden in the footnotes that you know, it's a pleasure to read those as well. So congratulations, Hassan, for pulling this together, and also I think it's a testimony, I think, to Paolo and SOAS development studies more generally, that you know, a lot of these discussions are very much informed clearly by Hassan's experience. I should say I've seen Hassan's this work of Hassan's move since he began at SOAS, and I've heard him speak on this a number of occasions in the last 8 years or so, and it's really exciting to see where it's ended up in this final product. So I had just a few questions, and I guess giving Hassan the chance to expand a little bit on maybe some of the theoretical dimensions, which he wanted, or he didn't go into much depth in what he said. So I wanted to begin with kind of the theoretical framework, which, as I said, it engages with a lot of different debates. But there's one individual that really stands out, and Hassan mentioned him, Samir Amin, a towering figure of Marxism, of dependency theory, of Egyptian, but writing very much in the African context as well. And he clearly is and very explicitly influencing the kind of approach in that Hassan takes in the book. So I wanted to, I guess my first question for Hassan is if he could spend a little bit of time telling us about what it is about Samir Amin's work that really kind of spoke to him, because it is actually, unfortunately, quite rare to hear or to see Amin in work on migration and borders. I can't actually think of this. So it's actually I think a very distinct and explicit conscious choice, I think, framing the approach in Samirian's work, who wrote obviously in the dependency theory framework, but I think was actually much more kind of nuanced than a lot of the kind of mainstream dependency theory, in that he really took paid a lot of attention to what was going on in the colonized countries themselves, the social relations in the colonized countries, that I think kind of the more other kinds of dependency theory tends to flatten those colonized countries, in my opinion, a bit too much. So that's my first question. I'll run through these before we, okay. So is giving Hassan this chance to speak a little bit more about Samir Amin and what he meant beyond, I guess, simply the question of Eurocentrism, even though he's very well known for his work on that question. The second point I wanted to raise actually relates exactly to that, is this critique of Eurocentrism, because Hassan made it very clear that he's looking at both a critique of the Eurocentric approach of policy to borders, to migrants, to so-called illegal populations, etc., that kind of Eurocentrism, but also the sometimes implicit Eurocentrism of how we as scholars might also think about these processes, even though we might be critical of the official policies. So I think this is something that really kind of, he kind of strikes a nice balance of looking at these different dimensions of what is Eurocentrism. But and again, referring to Samir Amin, he talks about how Samir Amin kind of traces this genealogy of Eurocentrism back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But my question is, bringing in the question of capitalism here, what does or did capitalism do? Because the kind of time frame that Hassan's looking at isn't just, it's also looking at kind of the pre-capitalist societies here. How did that kind of move to colonial capitalism shape the nature of Eurocentrism, if you like? What is distinctive about Eurocentrism within capitalism that is different from the Eurocentrism of the pre-capitalist times, if you like? The next point I wanted to bring up, the book in its title has the word race, migration, race, and labor in Mauritania. But it's actually quite striking when you read the book. The word race hardly appears. I think it appears like 6 times or something like that. What does appear, and we heard it tonight, is the framework of racialization. And I think this again is something that I found really kind of rich about the book, is that the emphasis is not upon race as something that's pre-given, or it's like an absolute quality that's defined by skin color or various biological characters, but it's actually something that's created through this process of racialization. In other words, racism is generated through this racialization, and I think you can hear a little bit tonight in how these processes produce these racial categories that then play a really important role in how migrants fit in. So there's a nice discussion in the book, for example, about the idea of Moors in 19th century colonialism. So I wanted to ask Hassan to kind of reflect a bit more on his choice of thinking about the category of race in this particular way as a process, and maybe some further examples of particularly the colonial period. How did the colonial period kind of create these racial categories? Because there's a lot of interesting material in the book about this. Okay, so I'm going to just finish with one more question, which is, I guess, the big question. And this also is a question. This is a question for Paolo, actually,
right?
And many other people here, and that is the borders question. Because again, we heard tonight, Hassan kind of draws from this autonomy of migration literature around borders and the idea that we need to consider the kind of agency of refugees, of migrants, of people who confront the border in shaping what the border actually is on one side, but also very carefully situates borders in capitalist social relations, both in Mauritania, but also in the EU, and the kind of connections between these different spaces. So my question is, and I'm not expecting you to answer this, but I'm sure you have some interesting things to say about it, which is what is and why are borders? I know Paolo also has a lot to say about this, around kind of, do we think of borders as being kind of forms of appearance of capitalism? Because one of the things that Hassan does in the book very well, I think, is, and again, Paolo also has done this, is critique this idea of the borders just are there because they do certain things. It's just a functionalist explanation of borders. So yeah, I wanted to throw that question in, and maybe hopefully generate some interesting discussion about that. But thank you again, Hassan, for writing this book.
Some answers, and then we collect, and then you return to some of them. What would you prefer?
Sure.
Are you ready to answer the small questions first, and then
They
the
all
big
seem pretty
question?
big.
How do you feel?
Yeah, I'll do one or two of those, and then I think if we open it up,
and then we return. I have them here. I'll pin you down on them.
yeah. Some of them will probably, I think will probably overlap. I feel really indebted to Samir. I mean, even though I don't, I think, share all of his politics, but he had a very kind of subtle emergence as a central figure to consider in the book, mainly just because when I was in these really early days of writing the PhD and looking at old issues of Review of African Political Economy, the few articles about Mauritania that are there, answering this question of the history that border externalization policies intervene within. Samir Amin was just this core reference about Mauritania that I found it hard to find many other scholars, any in fact, who seem to have this really close, fine-grained data on surplus extraction rates in this mining operation I mentioned. So really specific to Mauritania, but also somebody who had that kind of level of global vision. There are many phenomenal Mauritanian scholars and scholars on Mauritania that I'm indebted to, like Abdul Sheikh, Pierre Bonte, Armel Chopin, a bunch of people, but I can't think of anybody else with that level of detail about Mauritania on the one hand, but then had such a global vision of not just capitalist development, but Eurocentrism as well. And I picked up his book, Eurocentrism, just reading it for kind of leisurely purposes in the evenings at some point in the second or third year, and it only gradually became apparent that this was so central to what the book was about, because all of this scholarship that I was engaging with was about tackling Eurocentrism, and I learned at a certain point that he coined the term, I think in the 70s or 80s, and then wrote this book on Eurocentrism in 1988. But he was just conspicuously absent from all of these debates about what Eurocentrism is and how to avoid it in the study of externalization. And that book, this global intellectual history that critiques Eurocentrism by just highlighting how contingent it is. It only emerges at the turn of the 15th century with the first and second waves of European colonialism, and his intellectual history in that book spans so many other contexts and civilizations, and crucially, I think, shows universalism, which I didn't really delve into here. Universalism is something that is not a property of the European Enlightenment, and a lot of the other post-colonial and decolonial scholars that I was engaging with around the issue of Eurocentrism generally tended to kind of collapse the idea of universalism, with the idea of the Enlightenment, and therefore with colonialism and all the things that we're opposed to. And Amin seems to have this vision of a non-Eurocentric universalism, one that was anchored in, yes, ancient Greece and Rome, but also ancient like Egyptian antiquity, Persian civilization, and of course Islamic civilizations. And I found this call for a non-Eurocentric universalism that he makes in that book inspiring and a useful kind of juxtaposition to many of the other decolonial and post-colonial scholars that seem somewhat kind of more, I guess, provincial or less concerned with the universal and the global, and more rightfully so with the particular experiences that are excluded from Eurocentric Enlightenment thought. But they didn't seem to see any kind of a global shared universalist horizon beyond the violent exclusions of Eurocentric Enlightenment thought. And he does, and that I just found really useful. That does connect a little bit to other questions of agency and borders and race. I'll just speak a little bit about race and then I guess open it up. I think, and this also speaks to what is a product of European Enlightenment and colonial thought, and what is something that is beyond that relatively recent history, because race, it's interesting, I didn't mention it that much and focus on racialization, but I think the reason is that it's quite common to say that race was invented by European colonial powers to justify a hierarchy of labor subordination and enslavement at the extreme. And that is definitely true, but race in this context, and I think in many others, is not an exclusive product of the French colonial encounter. The idea of distinctions between people based on phenotype, based on, in this case, skin color, does absolutely predate the colonial encounter. The quote-unquote Moors in the Hassaniya dialect of Arabic are called the Bidan, which comes from the Arabic word abyad, which means white. And that is not something that the French told them to identify as, but it's something that predates the French colonial encounter. And that's why racialization and the racialization of territorial belonging in particular are the operative terms here. Because race, it's older, and white supremacy as a result, and Arab supremacy in that context is therefore older. But the idea that particular racial groups belong within linearly demarcated territories, and that therefore other groups don't and can be deported beyond those territories, that is something that didn't exist prior to the colonial encounter at the turn of the century. So racialization and the racialization of territorial belonging, that's why that's the most central big concepts. Yeah.
Look, I'm gonna take maybe a few questions. I'll start here at the front since you raised your hand.
Thank you. Sorry. First notes. That's great. Thank you so much for the presentation and congratulations on the book. I have two questions. One is the use of colonial to explain this, which on one hand is no-brainer because of this conceptualization of colonial capitalism. However, understanding by Samuel of the role of the informal economy vis-a-vis the processes that he defines as supra-informal economy are that of a need economy, which are that of a need economy, the need economy. So, but in a sense, do we need to anchor that to the concept of need economy to then understand how these people become the reservoir, right, for this border regime. Because I think it's just a bit more structural what you described in a sense of the dialectic between the two, as opposed to having a tool that is just leaving aside and then eventually gets sucked in. So the generative process of this surplus labor that you're looking at, I wonder what is how you see these people that are left behind, right? Is this laboring making? Is it like doing their own business? Is it an opportunity that makes them try? Because according to how we define them, these more contingent questions, we have a different understanding of their role in reinforcing this border regime. So that would be one question. The second question is on race. And I think your answer actually to Adam is quite compelling. And I wonder how you situate this vis-a-vis debate around racial capitalism and debate about racialization in Europe. So the work of, well, not of course Sally Robinson, which everybody would cite, but Satnam Virdi, for instance, which has a similar argument in terms of race predating capitalism and then getting entangled with it. And anyway, you know, when you present a lot of the stuff, you have a lot of big questions on your work.
Yeah. Thanks, Sally.
And questions about what's going on in the Canary Islands are also allowed, yeah? So, please, yeah.
Hassan, I wanted to ask about, obviously your ethnography was based on research up in 2018.
Yeah.
But with like more recent developments in the Sahel and how, in especially Malian displacement into Mauritania now, and the general rejection of French colonialism on the continent, what does it look like in terms of increasing governmentality around migrant infrastructure, where Mauritania is viewed by Europe as being an area, a location where you can contain migrant mobility more generally, but also as a source for extraction of foreign capital with like Glencore's interests in the mining industry.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the fish oil industry as well, and general kind of European extraction, which I think speaks very much to Amin's work.
Yeah.
So yeah, have you seen how that has developed in the time since your research?
Yeah.
And also how that's been met with, I suppose, perhaps resistance in the kind of challenging of that border with the Sahel more generally.
Yeah. Thanks.
Look, I can extend sorry, I'm going to extend it, take the liberty of extending and, use the question of what has happened since 2018 to ask in very simple terms, is externalization still the right word for us to think about the processes that you described, which seem to me, have not so much seized in impetus, but kind of radically transformed the way in which they operate. So I wonder if that, externalization still is the right way of thinking about, extraction, the interests of corporations, the EU governance and governmentality, and so on.
Cool. Yeah. Great questions. I'll respond to Anna first because the first question I don't have a long answer to because I arrived at the informal economy and Sanyal as an answer to the research question. So the object of study, the thing that I was delving into, was very much externalization and this condition of migrant illegality. The informal economy, Sanyal, and others who've written about it were part of the response to that question. So I don't have a very well thought out response about the nuances of his argument, the needs economy versus the accumulation economy. I did have the sense while reading his work, though, that if the labor capital relation that we are really focused on in globally, but because that's the form that capitalism takes in Europe, if that's not present in what he calls post-colonial capitalism, and instead that is only within the realm of the formal economy, but there is this needs economy where that tension doesn't exist. I did find myself asking similar question of to what extent it makes sense to still be focusing on capital and capitalism if there is a needs economy that is located outside of it and doesn't have a direct constitutive and contradictory relationship to capital as formal labor does. If the informal economy reproduces itself of its own internal dynamics, maybe as a result of capitalism's production of surplus populations, but which, in the words of Tanya Marie, at least today, that population exceeds the function of a reserve army if it's completely surplus. And these are all kind of open-ended questions that I've just been asking myself. I don't know if it's the correct assumptions or not, but I've been wondering to what extent it does even make sense to be focusing so centrally on capital and capitalism if there is this vast surplus humanity that isn't even playing this role of a reserve army, if this makes sense. In kind of more empirical details, the people, like dynamics of social reproduction would definitely be there in the informal economy. People selling CDs, sunglasses, offering car washing services, and those would primarily be men doing that kind of work, and women would come to cook big, vast pots of théoudien, this Senegalese rice, to feed all of these male workers in the informal economy. These sites that I was showing pictures of a moment ago, those would also be these big informal kitchens, basically, and canteens. So there's definitely those dynamics of social reproduction happening there, but again, not in a direct sense reproducing capital as women working, the wives of factory workers in 19th century England were. So I'm again wondering to what extent focusing exclusively on capital in a context in which there is such a vast pool of laborers who, I guess, the process of dispossession that Senegal River Valley, for example, that's one example of the processes that produce people having to live in making do in this kind of informal manner. But yeah, the relationship to the accumulation economy and the needs economy and capital, I'm still unsure about. The other question, race and racial capitalism, I've been thinking about in relation to post-colonial capitalism a bit, and it was through Gargi Bhattacharya's work on racial capitalism that I stumbled upon Sanyal's work and found the latter of more relevance to this context, simply because it's a quote-unquote global South context, whereas as the way that Cedric Robinson talks about racial capitalism, it is about Europe. It of course comes from the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa and the debates within different anti-apartheid groups that gave rise to the concept. And I've been thinking a bit about, and there's been a special issue by Zach Levinson about that South African tradition of racial capitalism and how it differs from the more prominent Cedric Robinson one that I've been thinking a little bit about and have a draft abstract about, actually, about which of the two might apply to Mauritania, but I haven't put it to much use yet. I'm inclined to think of kind of counterintuitively Cedric Robinson's one, even though I would like it to be the other, the South African tradition. But because Robinson makes this point that race precedes capitalism in the European feudal experience, that I can see kind of resonating in what's happening in Mauritania, where a Arab and Afro-Mauritanian regime of racial subordination that predates the European colonial encounter. But thanks as well, Salman Vardia, did you say?
That's not very deep.
Verdi, I'll have to.
Grappling from similar questions from Europe.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to look into their work a bit more directly. The upheaval in the Sahel since 2020 has really changed the stakes of EU migration management in the region as a whole. Obviously, the French have been kicked out of Mali, but EU Cap Sahel capacity building missions in Niger have had their equipment requisitioned. There was a pilot, I guess, EU military mission in Mali that was wound down as well shortly after the French military were ejected. And I think this has resulted in the Mauritanian state having a bit more bargaining power and leverage vis-a-vis European partners, because European partners are still desperate for reliable allies in the region, and Mauritania has kind of played that position in a, I think, kind of shrewd way, playing, I guess, kind of both sides, but has had severe tensions with the Malian government, and therefore might not be ready to, abandon the European partners and join the Alliance of Sahel States, for example, because of the effects of the counterinsurgency in northern Mali on the Mauritanian border. The level of the number of refugees, Malian refugees in eastern Mauritania, has also skyrocketed over the past 2 years in particular. And there have been killings of Mauritanian nationals by the Malian army, which has really it's been a cause of some diplomatic tension between the two in a way that I think might result in Mauritania keeping the Western allegiance and relationship open. What it's done to extraction, I think the point about extraction and the extractive industries and that issue of dependency, I think it renders the leverage the Mauritanian state might have in being of slightly more geopolitical importance to European partners than it was previously. I think it casts a different light on that leverage, because it shows that, yes, there is this increased bargaining power and leverage, but it's still a condition of dependency and a vast power disparity between the European partners and the Mauritanian state. It's still raw materials before fisheries, and now and iron ore, and now, as of this year, oil and gas, or liquefied natural gas. All of these economic aspects of the relationship between Mauritania, with the region more widely, and European partners, to my mind, they make me reluctant to say that it's the Mauritanian state who now has all of the cards in their dealings with Europe. There's still an asymmetry there, I think. I think externalization is still a useful concept insofar as it shines a wider light into the endemic structural crisis of the EU border regime, which for scholars of the Black Mediterranean is a crisis of Eurocentrism, and for Achille and Bembe, we're in this era of late Eurocentrism, which is quite different from the status it had at the time of Samir Amin's writing Eurocentrism. And this era of late Eurocentrism for him is one of withdrawal and battening down. And it's not the earlier period of hubris and outward expansion and dominance. And I think externalization is a reflection of that juncture. The inability for Europe to resolve its fascist underbelly, I guess. Externalization is a result of that. So to that extent, to the extent that it shows broader contradictions within what Europe is, I think is useful. When you start studying its effects and its logic, though, I think, as many scholars have argued, Philippe Freud, Lorena Gazzotti and many others, you can't look at it in and of itself. It has to be in relation to wider things that, for me, are colonialism, labor, and race, but many other things that could be informal economies or security assemblages or whatever. So yes and no, I guess.
Please.
Hi, Hassan, thank you for the talk. I'm GM, we're kind of talking about activism a bit, and actually thinking about activism and activism of xenophobia in Europe. And I think, I obviously know that, legal categories, policies, all inherently racialized, simplistic, and racialized, and being part of it. And I think maybe you could have made the argument 6, 7 years ago that the way we should approach activism is maybe to tackle those categories and unpack them and show how they're implicitly racist. But the current way politics is going, especially in the US and now in Europe, I fear that people are no longer worried about dancing around implicit subjects and implicit categorization. I think they're very much becoming very more explicit, and the nature of xenophobia, more common sense of belonging to frankly, and you were just talking about the externalization is trying to reconcile the clash underbelly of Europe. And I just wanted to ask maybe kind of two-pronged question, really, like, how we approach anti-racism now, maybe with what you just discussed. But yeah, actually, that's just that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
There's a
Oh, please, yes, I cannot see them. Thank you, Harry.
So this is from Dr. Godzi Utoma from the University of Nigeria. He says, thanks for the week. Talking about racial framing, rather than race or biological attitude, does any category of sub-Saharan Africa able to maneuver or to perceive or escape racialization? On the flip side, does any group of the lighter skin race, including Arabs and Berbers, including also Sahrawis, etc., find themselves entrapped at the receiving end of the racial framework? These questions are aimed to understand how different groups navigate their identity and meaning in citizenship.
Thanks. More? What does it mean for anti-racism? There's a couple of ways of answering this. One is that the subtitle of the book, Migration, Race and Labor, is kind of it's not the sequence of importance in political anti-racist terms necessarily, but potentially that too. But definitely, if you're looking at the policing of migration, in this context at least, you need to look at how the policing of migration is racialized and why me or a Egyptian national or a Arab or white European wouldn't be threatened with deportation in Mauritania for not having a residence permit in the same way that other people racialized as Black would be. And in the way that the book develops this thought, that also means needing to look at the quality of labor, the fact that people are also in the position of either being exploited for a profit that is extracted from them, that is rendered all the larger because of their undocumented status, or cast out completely and on the margins of the urban informal economy. And that quality of labor is absolutely equally, how it's experienced is racialized, but there's a certain sense in which I feel it is the underlying quality that race gets thrown on top of, and then the precarities of migration status get layered on top of that again. That might be one way of thinking about anti-racist politics. The labor dynamics underpinning it and how they intersect with labor struggles. Another, I guess, is centering anti-racism and white supremacy in discussions of deaths at sea, in particular, but also the abuses that happen on land. The fact that there are 10,000 deaths off the Atlantic coast over the past year, the abandoning in the deserts of people by Mauritanian police, by Tunisian, by Moroccans, with equipment donated by European partners. I think that whole process does need to be looked at in terms of white supremacy and be linked to anti-racist politics and struggles. And many groups are already doing that. But there's also, I guess, a temptation to maintain a certain narrower kind of human rights discourse in the discussion of these policies and abuses in order to keep the attention of policymakers and people who are directly and indirectly responsible for them, and to be kind of diplomatic and maybe leave the clear racial undertones of these practices and racist undertones of these practices in the background. And one other way of thinking about anti-racism and what it means for how anti-racist struggles and politics intersect with these abuses is to put race in the foreground and highlight the racially differentiated effects of these policies now, and also the history that those differentiations sustain. That, I think, links to quite closely to Ngozi's question, which is, I guess, how Arabs, Sahrawis, and people of North African descent, how they might experience these policies. I think it's, and conversely, how Afro-Mauritanians or people racialized as Black might experience them in other contexts. If I'm understanding the question right, it makes me think that these things are so situational and context dependent. Whether somebody is viewed as being a potential irregular migrant and therefore liable to be questioned about documents and detained, that wouldn't necessarily happen to a Moroccan national in Mauritania, but could very well happen to a Moroccan national in France. The same might be said for a somebody from Niger in Mauritania versus in Senegal. How people are racialized and whether they are racialized or not in the first place is not a universal process. It depends on how race operates in a given context, and whether one is identified as being racially other or not is dependent on the racial dynamics of that context. So if we can ask Ngozi if I've answered his question rightly or not later on, but that's what comes to mind in response.
Look, I think you still have a couple of questions to answer, but I think it's late, and this has been very rich and very generous on your part, of course, also on your part. But a lot of the effort, if not all of it, has been carried through by your research and your presentation. So thank you, Hassan. Thanks, everyone. And
there are discount flyers here. Did they go around already?
yes, I circulated.
Okay, cool. I mean, just download it for free, I think.
Yeah, it's mentioned.